Good. Well, first, welcome to everybody. We're waiting until 2:04 to start. As you know, we are in a different mode for this webinar, and in a minute, I will introduce Ron and have Ron give a little bit of background on himself. But we're going to wait till 2:04. For question and answer, we're going to be using the chat box. So on your screen in the top right-hand corner and in the right-hand bottom of your screen is send a public chat message. So if you have a question that comes up, go ahead and submit it there, and then I will ask Ron at the end of his presentation what you've put in the chat box. One of the reasons we're doing this. I'm hearing my echo. Yeah, one of the reasons that we're doing it this way is because we're just looking at different ways to protect those who are participants joining in terms of being able to post these lectures on a more public format. So that's what we're working through right now. We will start in just a minute. So we're just about ready to go, and I will introduce Ron when we start.
Trying to get my camera in the right position.
Yeah, actually, Ron, I thought your camera was better before. Now it's kind of looking up at you. So before it was a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's better. That's much better. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe tilt it up just slightly. There you go. Yeah, that's very good, Ron. Yeah. Okay, well, let's go. We're very pleased to start our next series on Central Asia. And we have a great lineup for you looking at a whole lot of different aspects of religion and mission and society in Central Asia. Today we have Ron George, who's got a fascinating talk on Hans Christian Andersen and Shamanism in Central Asia. Next week, we have John Heathershaw, who's an expert on post-Soviet realities within Central Asia. Then we have Barakatullah Ashraf, who is an expert on Central Asian Christianity. And finally, we will end up with our own lecturer here at OCMS, Dr. Paul Woods, who's going to be looking at issues of feminism within Central Asia. So we're very excited about this series. And we're very excited first to have Ron speak. So I'm going to turn it over to Ron, and he will introduce himself. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the public chat, and we will address this after Ron gets done. So with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all. I work in Moldova in a Christian university for Central Asians, and I've asked them to help me in a few other contexts, and it's really been a team effort. I first started my Christian experience coming to Christ, and the first thought I had was, if this was really true, it had to be truly true for everybody. And the worst case scenario that I could think of was Muslims living in communism, sort of a double prison. And from 1964, I've been working with Muslim people. I went with OM for 17 years, traveling through North Africa into Iran, Afghanistan, and then later on came back and put my kids in school, but continued to travel during the communist period into Russia and Central Asia, making contacts. I think we had probably 5 or 6 Christians that we knew of in the area. It was that barren. Of course, there are a lot of German Mennonites and Baptists and Pentecostals, but in terms of Muslim background believers, very, very few, and a lack of evangelism amongst those people. And so it's been a learning curve for me for the last 50 years. And I'm really just beginning to understand some of the issues that are before the church, and also the impact of what's going on in Central Asia, or has gone on in the world today. And that's why I call my lecture Hans Christian Andersen, and shamanism in Central Asia, because the Vikings, of course, was shamanistic, and Denmark still has that sort of a background and history. And I think it's also reflected in those fairy stories of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Grimm's fairy tales. You're getting something of a shamanistic storytelling coming through on that. And of course, that goes on to Walt Disney and Hollywood and so on. And even Trump Tower can be seen as a shamanistic symbol, 666 and all kinds of other things, if you wanted to look into that area. So it's a very broad religious system. And I think one of the things we have to do is to try to understand the impact that local shamanism and animism has on the potential for discipleship, and being sensitive to how people are discipled in such a culture. I'm not going to talk about the church under communism or even the presence of Christian groups within Russia and Central Asia. The indigenous church is an emerging church. It's small, it's fragile, and yet they're doing a wonderful job, and we're seeing fruit all the time. So my goal, my desire is to see an indigenous movement amongst Muslims, which is just beginning to emerge, that we call Messianic Muslims, Muslims who remain within the Islamic culture and amongst their people, but they are very similar to the Messianic Jewish movement. And it's wonderful to see local Central Asians beginning to say, well, how can I be an Uzbek and a Christian, or a Kazakh and a Christian, or a Tatar and a Christian? So I'm going to start with my slide set, which will give you points. Now, how do I get onto the slide set? Can somebody move me over? No, that's not it. Can you put me on slide, Tom? There we go. Okay. So shamanism in Central Asia, and of course it embodies Buddhism, Hinduism, and then later on it absorbed itself into Islam. So a lot of Islam in Central Asia has animistic elements in it, and this is brought out by the survey that I've done amongst all the friends and contacts that I've had down through the years. You might like to look at a Cambridge paper from Jonathan Burnside. He had an article in December 2010 on covert power, unmasking the world of witchcraft. And it's very relevant for the talk that we're having now, because how do we move it? Oh, there we go. There it is there. Good. He doesn't address Central Asia per se, but he is talking about the rise of witchcraft and animism, particularly in the Western world, but of course around the world. My talk is broken down into 10 sections, and this is just the introduction. If I can get it moving.
Okay.
There it is. Good. I've got the right button. This will encourage you, because these are Tatars and Central Asians in Siberia. And the Tatars were the Mongol soldiers that were left behind when the Mongol Empire died. And they are spread all over Central Asia. They are a minority group, usually Shiite, persecuted by the majority Sunnis, not really respected in Central Asia. But they're a wonderful people, and God is beginning to work amongst them. As always, he works with the people that are downtrodden and rejected. So this is a small Central Asian church, majority Tatars. They have introduced me to the Tatar Community Center in their city in Siberia. and we're having very good bonding with them. They are Tatar Muslims, but then underneath it, you have this animism and local culture. It's, this is typical of the Mongol steppe. There we go.
Got it? Right.
And yep. And the Mongols, the god of the Mongols was called the Great Blue Sky, Tengri. And he was the father figure. And the Mongols, Genghis Khan and his ilk, they saw that anything that existed under the blue sky belonged to them. And that was the reason that they felt that they should reach the whole of the world. The whole world should be dominated by those disciples of the Great Blue Sky, which never goes away. It's also the same word or similar word used in the Turkish Bible, Tanri. And just as thunder is frightening experience in a major storm in the early days, in pre-Christian days, and so they call that Thor. So also we get out of experience of life and all of its problems and trials, people beginning to assign God kind of characteristics. So wherever you look, a tree, a bird, a snake, a river, a mountain, a cloud, God was there, the spirit was there. So the essence of shamanism is that the shaman is one who leads his people in the spiritual quest and interprets. And in the absence of 20th century, 21st century medical facilities, the shaman was also a healer. So he would come up with seances, medicines, all kinds of things to drive away the spirits of sickness within those people. And that is still very much alive today. People wear amulets, the evil eye, the blue eye that the Turks wear, the Central Asians wear. That is to keep the evil spirits away from them. And it can currently be found in Central Asia, South Siberia. Shamanism is there. You've got the Tuva, the Mongol, the Buryat, the Kyrgyz, the Kazakh, the Tatars, the Yakut. They all have similar practices and are rooted or coming out of this Mongol experience. The second section is the understanding of the people that follow the Tengarist understanding of shamanism. And Tengarists are the people who follow Tanri, the god that are from the blue sky. And he is married to the Mother Earth. So you get the male and female coming together with the blue sky and the earth, the rivers, the rocks, the trees, the animals, the experiences of life that you go through. This is the female. And this is the introduction of the sexual element within shamanism and animism. I think you see this completely coming to a head with the New Age movement in the West. And if you look at the Trump Tower, it is designed in the male and female and male element to worship that kind of animistic world. We'll see that more later on. So you have the father, the blue sky, you have the mother, and these are mysteries that the shaman is there to try to unravel and help people with. Here's a female shaman seeking union with the great blue sky god. And then you have the elements in carpet. I've been freshly thrilled with getting into carpet design, because having worked in Iran for many years, we were well aware of the famous carpets, but Turkish people make carpets as well. And here you have on the left-hand side of your screen the eternal tree and the birds. This is the tree of life, which I think goes back to Genesis. And so you have this continuity from the Old Testament even through to shamanism. On the right-hand side, you've got a study that was done by Andrzej Rabotowski from Poland. his speciality has been looking at shamanism in rock carvings through Central Asia. And there's an example of one of his paintings and photographs. Here's this Yakut in the north, in northern Siberia, the Yakut shaman. The drum is very important. The dance is very important. Every element of his behavior is important to attract or detract the spirits, the evil spirits, the good spirits, to put them at service for the people in which he serves. And in that house that he has there, he will have all kinds of potions, herbs, poisons to give to people to help them on their journey. This is an interesting one. There's a Persian poet called Rumi, and he wrote Christian, Jew, Muslim, shaman, Zoroastrian, stone ground, mountain, river. Each has a secret way of being with a mystery, unique and not to be judged. And here you see the tree of life. This is a Persian carpet. The tree of life having the river coming out of the temple, could it be? But each one of the fruit is a different religious symbol. Of course, we also see it growing in the West. I've been in touch with a publishing house in the west of Wales that produces a magazine called The Shaman. And they have all kinds of guidance to promote and to develop shamanism. This woman has got almost like an Indian headdress, because you find the same religious systems amongst the North American Indians, the South American Indians. You find it in Africa and Asia. Wherever you go, you're going to find this animistic movement. Here's a rather more modern shaman, and she wrote, and she says, "My love is to dance with you in the spirit realms. I become like that of a hollow bone, allowing all energies that surface to flow through me, intuitively guiding me into an intimate relationship with the seen and unseen, helping you to trust the signpost within your human journey." Now that's lovely thoughts, but not very realistic in some way, because one of the things it misses out on is the fallen nature of man, how that man is evil and has sinned. So you will come across people like this all the time in almost every town and village here in the United Kingdom. Christianity has a long history in South and Central Asia. The Martoma Church, Syrian church in Kerala in India, dates to the missionary activity of Thomas the Apostle in the 1st century. So we have a church that has been in amongst these animistic people for centuries. And my challenge is to say we need to learn from these ancient churches how they have dealt with animistic practices and still being faithful to Jesus Christ. We need to learn from them and not import our Western models en bloc. I remember the first time I went to DGU University in Moldova to teach the first years, and they said, Mr. George, how can we get rid of the Western missionaries? They had got to a point where they realized that the Western missionary, with all his sincerity and all his education, just did not understand or relate to Central Asian people. And they saw this as a barrier. And it's been a long journey for many of the professors in the university to realize that we've got to try to develop a theology that fits with the Uzbek, the Kazakh, the Kyrgyz, the Turkmen, and so on. It's the fact of animism and the spirit world is an acknowledgement there is a spiritual world that exists, and we need to be able to tap into that sensitivity and to help people come to a full understanding of the Spirit of God as he works and is working in the world today. A shaman is chosen by spirits. He's not a normal person. And normally I've found that most shamans have had some kind of near-death experience. They've had a crisis. They've been ordinary farmers, business people, students, and they've had this unusual experience of near death, which opened up to them something more of the spirit world. I think we're beginning to see that in the West with COVID. People are daily coming into contact with death. And I think it's opening up questions that there is more than the materialistic world, that there is a spiritual world. And this movement of the spirit world is called Tangerism, from Tangri. It's a bit like saying you don't have to be a vicar to be a Christian or a Lama to be a Buddhist. We see many in the West who are not shamans, but have an understanding of shaman life. And they're struggling to give a term to that kind of spirituality. In other words, there are people who have a spirituality but can't express it. They don't know what it is. And they'll either turn to animism, and of course, it happens every day in our society. People are using all kinds of symbols and activities to fulfill their spiritual need, and so on. The secular society we produced a scientific age, and so we worship material things and are controlled by them. Just as the gods of Greece and Buddhism are inconsistent, so also is the material world fleeting and capricious. Isn't that true today of COVID? People who have relied upon materialism all their lives with the nanny state and everything else are suddenly up against this issue of death around the corner and visiting all and every person as he wishes. We have things like not walking under a ladder, or black cats walking in front of us, or throwing salt over our shoulder, or using shamanic crystals, or new age music. And you see again these things also within Celtic practices. So they're very much part and parcel of the Western and the British experience. And of course, we have fairies, wizards, goblins. They're all part of shamanism that's developing in the British society. It's in Central Asia, of course. Buddhism was much older, and Hinduism came in from India. So these religious systems were there, and animism has a way of absorbing those other systems and never being destroyed by them. And we find the same thing with Islam. In an attempt to integrate local folklore, Islam was changed. Islam does not have an ultimate truth. It does not have the spirit of Jesus Christ. And therefore, there's nothing to filter out truth from untruth. So Central Asian Islam is impregnated with animism, and the imam in a local mosque will be in the place of the shaman, and he will have curses and verses from the Quran to write. I've seen them writing verses on a slate, washing the slate, verses from the Quran, washing the slate and then drinking the water, because that was magic. That was the word of God. You're drinking the word of God. Or other examples of taking the oil, the paraffin oil that's in a mosque, in the lamps that light the mosque, and taking the oil and putting it in people's eyes in order to cure their eyes from blindness. Now, you get a 50-50 chance. They're either going to cure by itself, or you're going to go blind. So again, we find that these things are kept alive within the systems that are entering into this world. And I know that in the materialistic world, the business world of the Central Asian people, they still introduce shamanism at festivals that they want to have success in. They're like tribal medicine men. And they are said to foretell the future as well. Shamans would heal people by killing and eating the evil spirit, and talk about things happening in the spirit world. Oftentimes the shaman was hereditary. He passed his skills onto his men and women in the family. And of course, we can go back to ancient Rome, where people believed in an afterlife, and spirits were very important to people. They were called Salius priests, who were dancing, singing, and making music by striking weapons in each other's hands. They were similar to shamans, and they resemble the difference between there are resemblances between the shamans, the druids of the Celtic priests in white clothes, who make medicine from mistletoe hanging on a red oak. Very similar things as well. The magazine in the Wales is called sacredhoop.org. If you ever wanted to buy some copies of their magazine, and they say that Tengrism is having a revival in Central Asia, and it's coming in more and more into focus. This focusing is perhaps a redefining of the cultures after the collapse of an atheistic Soviet domination, and looking to what is meaningful from the past. So rather than saying Tengrism or animism or the shaman is of no value today in the 21st century, they are in fact actually more valuable, because there has been nothing to replace the atheism of the Russian Empire. And so the church is going to be affected by this rise and must have an answer for it. And it's no good just saying it's evil or it's no good. You've got to ignore it, because it won't go away. And so the church has to face this worldview and deliver people from it. Is one of the instruments that are used. I was in a Kyrgyz camp in eastern Turkey, and I went to see one of the leaders there. He was actually the postman in the village. They had run away from the Russian communism in Central Asia, and they'd gone to China. In China, communism came, they ran away from there, and they went to Afghanistan, Wakhan corridor. The Russians came to Afghanistan, so they ran away from Afghanistan, they went to Pakistan, and eventually the Turkish government airlifted the whole tribe to eastern Turkey, which was land owned by the Kurds. And they brought their shamanism with them. And this postman was there so that people could come to him. He would play this instrument, go into a trance, and then ask them what the questions were that they had. Am I going to be successful? Will I have a husband? Will I have a child? Will the child be a boy? Will I pass my exams? Will I pass my driving license? And the shaman was there to guide and reinforce the people's beliefs and system. Another thing that comes out of all this is the relationship between the color blue, which is the great sky, and the use of blue in the mosques, particularly in Central Asia and Iran, turquoise, blue mosques. And this again is another expression of the infiltration of animism into Islam, as it is reflected in this way. So other resources you might like to look at, there's www.tengrism.org, and there's a couple of books. Another website, buryatmongol.org, and there are a couple of books, Riding Wind Horses and Chosen by the Spirits. There is a lot of material out there that really never touches the church and never touches most missionaries. But we need a generation of people who will study and understand and work in these areas. Now, I was talking about animism in UK. Well, here's a tree in Scotland which is impregnated with coins. Maybe when you've been to a house or a river, you've thrown a coin into a pond. That is all part of the worship of the spirit of that river, that lake, that wood, that tree, that village. That's what's going on here. And of course, we see it every day in children's TV. Where shamanism is being dressed up in Western culture, and we need to be able to speak about these things within the church, within the discipleship class, and to be able to identify what is actually going on. So for this lecture, and I want to try to go back to, there we go. We're on section 3 now. We need to understand what we mean by Central Asia. And there are different definitions of where Central Asia is. It could be the Asian part of the old Soviet Empire. It could be the territory of Turks and Persians, because the Turks were related to the Mongols. They are an Altaic people, as the Finns are. And all the way from Mongolia, all the way through to Egypt and Iran, Turkey, Istanbul. That was a huge area of influence for animism. So the territory of Turks and Persians, that includes Iran, Afghanistan, North Pakistan, North India. We could call it the territory of the Mongol Empire, because they reached up to the gates of Moscow. That territory east of the Urals to Japan, north to Siberia, and south to India. And it includes the Caucasus. Although the Caucasians are not Central Asian peoples, they do have Central Asians living amongst them, as does Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, New York, and London. They are everywhere. So it's a wide brief to talk about Central Asia. There's the map going from Japan in the east, Mongolia here, up into Russia, all the way through to Eastern Europe and down into this area here. Thierry Zarconi and Angela Hobart offered a vigorous and authoritative explanation of the link between Islam and shamanism in contemporary Muslim culture. Shamanism and Islam thus incorporate shamanistic practices in Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, the Balkans, to show how the Muslim shaman, like his Siberian counterpart, cultivated personal relations with the spirits to help individuals through healing and divination. It uses the complexities and varieties of rituals involving music, dance, and in some regions, epic and bardic poetry, demonstrating the close links between the shaman and the various arts in the Islamic world. Very rarely does the Christian church get involved in arts and poetry, but it is part of that culture that we're seeking to influence. Animism is a belief that objects, places, creatures all possess a distinct spiritual essence. Potentially, animism perceives all things, animals, birds, plants, rocks, rivers, weather systems, human handiwork, and even words, as animated and alive. Drumming on the shaman's drum induces a trance-like state in which the shaman is able to minister to needy hearts and foretell the future, as well as to heal and advise. And in terms of a popular level, you might like to watch a few episodes of Resurrection, which is the history of the Ottoman Empire on Netflix. It's a very good illustration of the Mongol clash with Turks and the movement of the Turks towards Constantinople and the role of shamans within that movement. Then on our fourth section, there's academic work that has been done mainly by the Russians, but there are also a few Victorian academics from Britain who have been involved, and they've looked at the activities of shamans. And it says here, we still recite prayers to the honor of our Arawaks, spirits of dead ancestors. I know in Iran, when I was there, our neighbor had lost a relative, and the mourning period was 4 weeks after the funeral, then 4 months, and then 4 years, and then 40 years. You continually honored the dead by celebrating their death at regular periods for the rest of your life. And that's very much a part of the culture in Persian amongst Persian people. Turks would like to honor their dead and pray for their peace. There's this terrible thought that there's no peace beyond the grave. So what is a shaman? He's the most ancient spiritual and healing practice known to man. In fact, shamanism and shamanic healing goes back about 100,000 years and has been practiced all across the globe, well before our current technologies of communication were possible. Shamanism organically arose over the world all through history and is a response to the needs of people. You go down to the Brazilian jungle, you'll find the same thing there. People without a living God and without the knowledge of the one true living God are going to automatically move towards the human interpretation of events around them. Here's another activity that is done. Smoke assists the sky spirits by the devotee. He blows on powder and sends his breath up to the sky god as part of his worship. Interestingly enough, I have come across some Christian groups also practice blowing upon people as a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And here is somewhere that we can link in with the local people and talk about things of common experience. He has a lot of responsibilities all through the people that he serves. And of course, the shamans and the animist was also an environmentalist. And we see this complaint with the North American Indians that everything was fine until the Westerners came and started shooting the buffalo, polluting the rivers, cutting down the trees. The battle is still going on in Washington today between the Eskimos and the North American Indians, and the pollution of the rivers and the catching of the fish. Somehow we've lost our way in terms of understanding the God of creation. We need to develop a theology of creation so that the Christian can influence society to take care of the environment in which we live. So any one of you might be saying, how do I become a shaman? Well, by birth. In many tribes, it said the spirit chooses to incarnate himself as a shaman before he was even born into a physical existence. By initiation, in other cultures, prospective shamans must undergo what is known as shamanic initiation. This happens through courageously enduring terrifying circumstances. In the Vikings series in Netflix, there's a man called Flocky, and he is tired of all the bloodletting and killing, and he takes his time. He goes up in the middle of the winter into the mountains, and everybody expects that he's going to die. But when he comes back transformed as a shaman. And the rest of the story is how Flocky influences the teaching and the guidance of the Vikings through that experience in the wilderness, and by calling, usually, as I've mentioned, through a near-death experience. We need to understand the Bible is not unaware of all this. So we've got Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy. God was constantly challenging the Jews to stay away from sorcerers. And we see sorcery raising its ugly head in Acts. In Deuteronomy 18, we have, when thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God gives thee, you shall not learn to do all the abominations of those nations. And in 10, there shall not be found among you anyone that makes his son or his daughter pass through fire, or uses divination, an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch. These are definitely outside of the Judeo-Christian mandate, and therefore we need to be able to take the truth of the living God to people that do believe in those things. Galatians, now the works of the flesh are manifest, and these are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, and so on. Samuel, rebellion is a sin of witchcraft, and Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, because he sought a familiar spirit to inquire of it. Now we come to something a little more personal. You might say, well, what right do I have to speak about shamanism and Central Asian Islam? Well, for 50 years now, I've been working with Muslims, and I've visited at least 38 different countries, and I'm beginning to see a commonality wherever I go. And it started off in North Africa. One of our team members, a man called Adrian Ravenhill, He had been a missionary in a hospital in Pakistan, and he told me how that he had been in a hospital, a Christian hospital in Pakistan, and he found himself being dragged down a hallway where he was staying by some unknown force. He cried out and was released, and no human was involved in that incident. I did not understand it. He didn't understand what was going on, I don't think. And yet we come across these stories from time to time of spirits really attacking Christians. I had a team, we had teams in Turkey going to every city in Turkey taking New Testaments. We gave every person that came with our team 10 New Testaments, and they were taught how to give them to people that they met. And the thing that emerged over the years that we did this, every summer we did this, we found that the cities and towns and villages that had shrines or special trees were hard and difficult to reach the people. But those that didn't have those presences were more free, more friendly, more hospitable. And I put it down to the fact that people lived in darkness when they had this animistic spirit. And in many ways, Islam is against this kind of teaching, but it can't stop it. It's there amongst the people. And so wherever you go, you're going to have to need a battery of praying people for the ministry that you have, not only in Central Asia, but other places. If you go to Turkey, you will find that if a family has a young man who's died before he got married, they will put a monument outside the house for a period of mourning. And that monument is made up of silver and glass and electric light bulbs to shine the light in that monument. And this is related back to Diana, goddess of the Ephesians and of silver in Acts 19. So pre-Islamic, even pre-Christian activities are incorporated into Islam and its practices, and also I would say the church in some of these places. There's also in Morocco things, or right through North Africa, things called zawiyas. And these are like fortresses up in the mountains where people would go to meditate, to be taught by an imam. And those zawiyas usually were formed around the tomb of a dead saint. Oftentimes those saints were Christian saints taken over by Islam and made into an Islamic saint. But we saw women coming to those saints and touching the tomb to receive barakah or blessing, or to have a promise fulfilled, or a success in trade, or a student to get good grades. People believed in these zawiyas. And we were invited to eat with all the people that were in that zawiya, and we ate, we sat with them, and we were able to give them a New Testament. I don't know what happened as a result of those New Testaments, but I do know that the church in North Africa, in Morocco, in Algeria, has gone from 10 to over 300 to 400,000 people in the last 10 or 20 years that we have seen things happening there. Trees with ribbons. The blue color ribbon is tied to a tree, and there were common sites for asking for prayer. Oftentimes it was a sheet from a wedding bed from the couple that just got married in order to gain fertility in birthing sons. Oil from mosques, I've mentioned. If you go to Gaziantep, you've got the lake in the pond in the mosque, where there are huge, great carp. And these are said to have been the carp that Abraham put into the lake, because they're not far from northern Iraq, where Abraham passed through on his way to the Holy Land. The evil eye I've mentioned. This is a cloth. It can be woven into a cloth. It can be a bead that you put around the neck of a child or a woman. But it's to keep away evil spirits. They put it over the new car, or over a washing machine, or part of decoration. And similarly, peacock's feathers are used, because the eye on the peacock feather is seen to be the eye of God, relating back to the eye of Horus of Egypt, the god of Egypt. And so almost anything can be co-opted into this world and given new meaning. I've already mentioned the shaman with the Saz in the eastern Turkey. In 1990-91, Gorbachev was overthrown. It seemed like evil powers were released. Mrs. Thatcher was overthrown. Slavic Gospel Mission was overthrown, the leadership. Tearfund and other missions leaders were put down and suffered humiliation in many ways. And we got to recognize that in the corridors of power, there are evil spirits working all the time. Millions of us are aware of the zodiac signs that we're born under. These horoscopes often dominate the lives of those who believe and follow them, thus ensnaring them into the spirits behind them, rather than having the God-given freedom to make choices in our own life. And then, of course, finally, not finally, but lastly, I've got it, is numerology. The use of numerology to foretell the future. Here's an example, number 7, of foreign missions in Central Asia. Korean Baptist mission was analyzed by a man called Wee-Jun Choi, and his estimation was the reluctance of Korean missionaries to surrender authority. One of the most critical issues facing Korean Baptist missionaries today is the widespread reluctance to transfer leadership to indigenous peoples and churches. This is strange to me because the Koreans speak a form of Turkish language. They are Altaic language. They have shamans. They are a people with one language. And it appealed to, I was thinking, well, why is it that Koreans are not being sensitive to Central Asians? Well, maybe it's because they know what Central Asia is like, because they're coming from a similar culture. And so it's going to take several generations before there's individual churches, indigenous churches, developing in Central Asia. And we've got to take this on board, this kind of cultural discipleship, understanding the culture and doing it in a cultural way. The Koreans were authoritarian, typical of Turks, very authoritarian, reluctant to pass on the baton, and derives partly from the Korean style of leadership. They do not completely trust the ability of Kazakh and Kyrgyz and Turkmen nationals. So we need to rethink priorities and see how Korean churches can be more faithful in understanding what they're doing. If Western missions were blamed for paternalism, Koreans may be accused of authoritarianism in the midst of deployment policies. As a result, they may not treat local people as co-workers, but rather impose their own ways of doing mission. I was in a church in the Philippines, full of Filipinos, but it had been started by a Korean. And after the church service, we all went round the back of the church and we sat down on chair or stools that Koreans sit on, and we had Korean food. And the Korean missionary had trained the Filipinos to eat and sit like Koreans. It was absolutely incredible. And it would be a joy to find an indigenous people developing their own theology and their own mission. Right, I've got some reports now from different people that I know. And these are letters that I'm going to read out to you. Shamanism has deep roots in Kazakhstan and among Turkic peoples of the Central Asian region. It's mixed with Islam. They have sacred trees, rocks, sites that people attend for prayer and meditation. There are a lot of different traditions that people still observe, including Christians sometimes. People stop by a sacred tree and must tie a white ribbon or some ancient form of worship to local spirits or sacred spring of water that people draw from, believing it will bless their lives and give them healthy children. Here's a classic case of the need for discipleship, knowing what's going on. And of course, the Kazakhs, many of them are struggling with identity. When driving by the cemetery, people say a short prayer to Allah out of fear of spirits of the dead. How inconsistent can you be to believe in an all-purposeful, all-powerful God, but fearing the Holy Spirit, the evil spirits that are all around you at a cemetery? Despite the growth of Islam, and Kazakhs here talk and believe Tangri, eternal blue sky, people burn special grass that has a special stench that they believe evil spirits run away from. With their sheep, when they slay a sheep, they always carve a cross on the animal, on the forehead. Old Christians who used to be there have passed on this kind of symbolism. That was from Yerkin. He was the head of the Pentecostal church in Kazakhstan. This is a letter from a missionary from working with Bulgarian Turks. His wife talked to women and compiled a list of 140 occult practices in which they were all involved. It was very, very rough Turkish. Here we go. Once we went to a museum of ethnicity in Sliven, Bulgaria, and saw references to the Bulgarians being worshippers of the god Tangri. Well, of course, Bulgaria was dominated by the Turks as well. Here's another one. In Turkish culture and shamanistic elements, for example, on Friday, many Turkish families bake 7 breads, a tradition devoted to remember, even worship our ancestors. And then also at funerals, they bring out, and especially at namaz, Muslim prayer for the dead, is a huge issue, he said. I had a very good report from Afghanistan, a young man that I knew, I still know. He led some 300 Afghans to Jesus Christ, and he finally had to leave and go to another country. But he says shamanism in Yakalong province, in Bamiyan province of Afghanistan, is located. He remembers a number of mullahs and sheikhs practiced witchcraft, and people in the area had special belief and respected them. And he even gives the names of those people. They went there for sickness, to remove the genie out of the body, to find lost objects, to solve problems between husband and wife, pray for a woman to get pregnant, praying for a son if she has already girls, praying to stop somebody good business, and praying to a woman to get a divorce from her husband, and so on. These are all the other things: killing specific animals, throwing sticks, putting on special clothing so that the demons get out of the clothing. They have predictions for the future. So shamanism, my summary of what, and I've got other papers too from DGU. They interviewed the students, and some of them were not even aware that shamanism was existing in their republics. But shamanism will never be eliminated. It is not a central organization. There's no ordination. There's no central control. It is diverse and varied throughout the world, not political, although it can be used for that end. After all, we see elements of it in UK national life to this day. What we can do is to contextualize both the shaman, animistic, and Islamic elements in a contextual way. And this can be one of 3 things: good, bad, or neutral. And what are the positive things? For example, in Surah 97, when you read that in the Quran, it's actually the story of the nativity in an Arab format. And we've done a lot of research into the content of the Quran and the Hadith. And these are all borrowed from the Old Testament and from other sources. And we need to be able to identify and source them. This brings us to how to approach. We've got 5 minutes, 10 minutes left. This brings us to show the approach to a situation with a shaman and its adherents through contextualization. I have a book here called What Others Have Said, and this is a collection of stories or accounts. Where are we? Here we go. What Others Have Said. It's just a collection of about 20 stories of how different countries, different ages have contextualized the gospel in the past. If any of you want a copy of that, just send me an email and I'll send an electronic copy to you. Let's go on. There's a range of attitudes held by church leaders and missionaries regarding the term contextualization. This range goes from being an expression of liberal theology, a watering down of the gospel, and a counter-reformation Trojan horse, to a clear expression of biblical truth. So there are three aspects of this. When we apply the scriptures, we need to understand the interpretation of scripture within our own culture. The English have interpreted the Bible in a cultural way. Secondly, missionaries going from the West have taken the scriptures and the gospel in the interpretation that they have had. They've got cultural glasses on as well. And we need to work towards the interpretation of scripture by nationals in Asia and Africa. We need to be encouraging the development of Asian theologians and African theologians who will take on the theology for their own nation. And I'm sure OCMS does some of that, if not all the time. Here we have the content, Robert D. Nobili in India, Reichardt in Thailand. There's the water buffalo theology of Kasumo Basetti Sani in the Arab world. He went to the Arab world hating Islam. He wanted to destroy Islam. But the more he mixed with Muslims in Egypt while he was learning Arabic, he realized that they were a gracious, loving, hospitable people. And therefore he reinterpreted the Quran in the light of Christ. And there are others. There's the Crown of Hinduism from India, which is a fascinating book. And we have written booklets on Quranic subjects using another book that we've developed, and this is the concordance of the Quran. It's very helpful, and again, I can send you that free of charge if you want a copy. Let's go on now. Let's come to conclusion. We've got 5 minutes before we answer or try to answer questions. Conclusions. 1. Shamanism is as old as man himself and derives from observing nature without having a foundation of a creator God. 2, it is found in every country, every people, tribe in the world to some degree. It is not organized, but serves to help their followers in terms of healing and medicines in many cases. Medicine men of North American Indians, Amazonian Indians, Africa, Europeans, including Vikings, Asians, Maoris, Aboriginals in Australia. It will not be eliminated by the skill of context, but the skill of contextualization can be used as a tool to interpret with a biblical basis. For example, a holy river, a river that's got a spirit. We can use that water as the water of life. Jesus was baptized in the water and he makes all things pure. So we start where the people are and we move them onto where we want them to be. With the dilution of biblical Christianity and world vision, other spirits are able to flood in on becoming established through radio, TV, and the arts in any country. 7, the skills of contextualization need to be applied to shamanism to make any long-lasting indigenous movements to Christ. Look at how the Christmas tree is used all over the world at Christmas time. Even Muslims in Pakistan buy Christmas trees. That is part of that shamanism, because the Christmas tree was a holy thing in Germany, and we imported it. Same with mistletoe and holly and the ivy. We've done the same thing. So if you want to look at the Journal of Shamanism, there's www.isars.org. There's the Jubilee Center, Cambridge, I've mentioned that. There's the East-West report about the Korean Baptist mission. We can look at the Lord of the Rings, the Vikings, Snow White and Cinderella, Rip Van Winkle. These all come out of a the culture that was before Hans Andersen wrote his stories. He had that culture of Vikings and shamanism within Denmark, and you'll find it. I've never been to Denmark really, but you'll find it still there, underlying the culture. And these stories are stories retold for the Western audience. And in the absence of 21st century medical industry, the shaman and animism took care of people and to interpret events for them and guided them through a walk in life. There's my email. No, not that one. That's my later edition. Anyway, OCMS has my email if you need it. Let me just add this note. Transgenderism has suddenly come into play. And here's a picture of a statue that is supposed to be Apollo. And this is part of that symbolism of what's coming into the world today. I want to show you the Masonic symbol, the triangle. The triangle again with 6 trees and 6 trees and 6 trees. This is the lower basis of the Trump Tower. There's the Trump Tower. And Apollo is painted onto the rooms of Trump's building up there, one of the floors in the penthouse. And you've got the phallic symbol, the male and the female, there as part of that Masonic symbolism. And I think it's infiltrating every area of the world. To mislead those who deserve only to be misled, to conceal the truth which it calls light from them, to draw them away from it. Truth is not those who are unworthy to, or unable to receive it or would pervert it. And that was written by Albert Pike, one of the leaders of the Masonic movement. So we are in a spiritual warfare, and we need to be well trained to understand our world in which we live. There's our 3 o'clock.
There we go. Thank you very much.
3 o'clock. Over to you, Tom.
Okay, well, we have some very good questions that are already lined up. We have one from Ethiopia that asks, thank you for this extremely fascinating presentation and insight. Is it possible to detach a religion from the context it takes place? Doesn't a believer's culture influence their belief faith, be it Christianity or Islam? And thank you very much again. So,
absolutely. Absolutely. This is one of the problems of the missionary movement. It's always had a problem with the contextualizing the gospel into the culture of the people. And I don't think a Westerner can do that, or another national going into a people. It's got to be the people themselves in studying the scriptures to be able to apply those scriptures to the local situation and circumstances. So the local people must be more forthright in searching the scriptures and applying them as they understand the local culture. We don't. The outsider does not understand that culture as an insider does.
Okay, here we go. Another one. Early in your lecture, you suggested that Christians make little use of art and poetry. That may be true of evangelical Protestants, but it is certainly not true of Orthodox, Pentecostal, and some Catholic churches. However, my question is whether the over-intellectualization of Christian faith leaves a wide gap in human meaning-making that shamanism and other practices then fill.
Absolutely, yes, yes. The human heart desires things of beauty. I've got paintings on the wall here. I don't know if you can see them behind my shoulder. They were done by children, 7, 8, 10-year-old children in Afghanistan who were street children. We taught them to draw with a pencil, squares, blocks, circles. Eventually it ended up doing oil paintings, and we would bring them to England and we sold those oil paintings, and those children were transformed by doing something that was artistic. And I think the church needs to be that, to do that more and more. We need to be celebrating life. We have become too intellectual, I think.
Okay, let me ask another question. I just recently attended a local village church where we attend, and the pastor talked about the beginnings of the Harvest Festival or the Harvest Worship Service we were having, and went back to its early times when local farmers or the people baking bread and everything, they already had a shamanistic practice of delivering the bread and consuming it to the gods. And then they began to bring it to the church, and then they would bless it. And this slowly evolved into the worship of harvest at that time. And in this, it's very interesting. Being in a village church, we do Rogation Sunday, where we go and pray for all the fruit trees and everything else. But the question here is, Ron, it seems to me that one of the ways that contextualization takes place is to redirect shamanistic practices to then conform to a proper worship of God. Because that's what people know. That's what we do. Are you for that, or are you thinking that it needs to be scrubbed clean and not have Christmas trees, not have Easter services, not have harvest festivals, but somehow invent some kind of non-cultural? Because everything we've got has somehow been tinged somewhat by shamanism.
Well, two examples: the Russian communist system tried to eliminate religion in Central Asia and in Russia. As soon as they were gone, it all came back up again. And the same thing happened in Japan, where they persecuted the church. The Japanese leaders persecuted the church, and the Catholic Church disappeared in Japan for 100 years. As soon as the persecution was over, Catholicism re-emerged. So I don't think you're going to eliminate religion. But what we can do is to say, this which you have is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ.
Okay. Well, let me ask another question in that, because one of the things that I've always, because I teach theology, and I was teaching theology in Asia, where all this is both where my students are coming out of and in going in and out. And one of the things that I did notice is that oftentimes in our own Christian worship service, there are shamanistic type tendencies. All right, I'm treading on dangerous ground here, but it seems to me that a lot of the prayer services and everything that we were doing, especially with the kind of activities of prayer walks or circles or that kind of thing, was in a sense, almost in that magical sense of forcing God to respond. That if we did this in a certain sort of way, then in some ways we were binding God to some action. And as a Presbyterian, I struggle with that. So anyway, I just thought I'd put that before you. How do you see that? Is that the problem, in the sense of getting a lean on God through these things? Is that where the problem lies?
I think it's a lack of teaching. People are folk Christians in many ways, although they may be evangelicals. And for example, singing the same song over and over and over and over again, it's like being in a trance. Or name it, tell God, you name it and you get it. And it doesn't work that way. God works through suffering. Okay. And this wealth and health and wealth doctrine, yes, God does make you wealthy. God does make you healthy if you live a life that is in keeping with human physiology. But at the same time, you can't demand it from God. He may choose another path. And life is not that simple. And I look at some of the comments that are coming out of the right wing and left wing in America during the elections, and it's a similar thing. They're not intelligently analyzing what's going on, or what is happening, or what could go on. It's coming out of fear and superstition.
Okay, we have another question that's looking at to go back and see what connection were you pointing towards in terms of the example of the Korean Christians in terms of shamanism. So what was the point there in terms of authoritarianism and shamanism? What was how does this tie into your lecture?
Well, I think one of the blessings was to have American Presbyterians going to Korea to bring the gospel. And they established theological training centers but at the same time, they brought a certain discipline of thinking. And the Korean missionaries have taken on that same spirit when they've gone on to the rest of the world and become authoritarian. It fits their nature as well. But
how does that relate to shamanism, Ron? That's the question. Well, my Presbyterian heirs would want to.
Well, what they've done is completely thrown over the culture.
Okay.
They've rejected, and so there's this big argument between whether you honor your parents who've died or whether you don't go and celebrate their death. The classic conflict in the church.
Yeah.
And so the church has sided with being a good Presbyterian and do not do anything that is possibly rooted in shamanism.
Okay.
Instead of saying, okay, let's take shamanism and turn it for good.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Ron. Here's another one. Where do we draw the line between cultural syncretism and theological contextualization? For example, you gave us you talked of the mosque painted with blue color and noted that it's interpreted as an infiltration of shamanism. Could it be interpreted as contextualization to make the religious building culturally familiar to the local people?
I had this battle many years ago, and I was struggling with contextualization. And I thought, well, the people that would understand this would be the White Fathers in London, the Catholic order. So I went to see them, and I talked to Owen Shorter, who wrote on contextualization and indigenization. And I said, Owen, where do you draw the line when you step over that line and you're being syncretistic? And he said, Ron, all theology is syncretistic.
Yeah.
And I nearly rose up and argued with him. That later on I realized what he'd said. I have the Bible. I read the Bible from my cultural perspective. It speaks to me and it works. So as a result, we have a local church that say is a brethren assembly. But then that immediately gets stuck in time. So now we've got brethren assemblies that were contextual. They met the needs of the people at the time it started, but did not continue to keep up with the culture. And so they're out of date, out of touch, out of sync with the Spirit of God. And so you find the same thing with the Catholic Church. They contextualize and then they don't move. They've fossilized. And the key is continuous revival, continuous renewal. Let the word of God be manifested in flesh, and that result is then brought under the judgment of the word of God. This cycle keeps going. Renewal and change and renewal and change, rather than having an expression of faith, and rather than saying, well, that expression of faith was biblical when I was 17, therefore it must be true now that I'm 75, because it's the Bible. Well, no, the culture has moved on, and what I am at 75 is the same as when I was 17. So there has to be change, constant change, and evaluation.
Let me give you another thought of, are there ways in which shamanism in its sense and how that can be teaching to us? Now, let me give you an example of that. We've been following the fires in California. That's where I grew up, and I actually served as a firefighter for many, many years. And one of the things that I began to pay attention to was that the Native Americans in California and the tribal peoples were much better at managing the forests. And one of the reasons that they did that is because their very shamanism made them listen to and respond to the rhythms of nature, and as strange as that sounds. And one of the things, just as an observer and a strong Christian at the same time, Western culture, and informed by Christianity, tends to be a distinction between creation and the creator. So it's not a sense of living being so much as a creation, all right? At least, the earth and the woods and the trees, that kind of thing. Are there things that we as Christians can learn about that deep listening to the rhythms of the earth and then handle things like climate change and other things better? I say that very sincerely because my hometown was burning a few weeks ago, and the mountain I grew up that was just behind me was in flames. And part of that, I know, is due to bad practices that have taken place since Westerners have arrived in California, and the taking of the forests for what seemed reasons to them, but what they left were mountains ready to become flaming torches, as we've seen this summer.
Yeah. I think part of the problem is Protestantism. It doesn't have a deep spirituality.
No.
It has an emphasis on the word, intellectual truth, and agreeing with certain doctrines. The Catholic Church seems to have a deep spirituality, and you find some of the writers, like Friedheim. I don't know if you know Friedheim, but he writes about creation. After reading him, I discovered he was a Catholic. But he writes about this bond between God and his creation, and how we are to take part in creation as custodians of something very holy, something very precious, which the Indian shaman already has that concept, that this is holy, this is godly, this is for the community, it's for good. And we just look upon it as, from a scientific point of view, it's a piece of wood. No, it's more than that. It's beauty, it's aesthetic, it's got meaning, it's got purpose, it's got a meaning in life. And we need to take our kids back to that world and the next generation.
Got a comment here, and it says, Ida Glazer sees in Genesis 1 through 11 an illustration of religion as combining truth and error, and sees Islam as a good example. If shamanism is also an example of this, are there elements in shamanism that can be very intriguing in terms of our teaching of the Bible?
Oh, that's a big one. I'm sure there is. I mean, when you stop learning, you dry up. And I'm sure there is something that the shaman and the people of Central Asia can teach us and show us and help us to become more spiritual and more fulfilled. Again, the Bible has to be our resource for truth, and therefore anything that we discover must be brought under the judgment of the Word of God. But so many things we don't even think about, and it's the same with the Muslim imams. There are some godly imams. They've walked on this earth for years and years and years, and they've learned much. But they're caught in that religious system as well.
Yeah, well, so, that's a good answer. I think it's probably about time to bring this to an end and tie a bow on it. We've got the questions are through, at least in terms of what I can see here. I'm seeing more on there. But I just want to thank you, Ron. I think it's been absolutely fascinating. And I think all of us, especially those of us who worked with missionaries and worked in foreign cultures, know so many of the things that you're speaking of have been part and parcel of what we've bumped into. I think also deeply appreciative of your comment of how the local person and the Christian on the ground there has to work these things out. The Western missionary just isn't going to have all the answers, especially in these areas, because these areas are very close to life.
Yeah.
But with that, again, we thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today. And I think it's gone pretty good. The tech worked out, and so good. Well, thank you very much, Ron. And with that, we will bid adieu.
Thank you.
All right.
It's a joy.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. I'm going to stop the webinar.